CJ, am I in the line of sight here? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I may be the very newest member of the North Texas chapter of the Native Plant Society because I'm more of a bug person, as has been mentioned, which is why it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, uh, Joshua Byrne. I know him online because he helps us identify insects every day. He's a group expert in our Facebook group, Ammons Hill, so we can call on him with his professional entomological knowledge to identify orthopterans, which are grasshoppers and katydids and crickets, and also beetles, as he's wearing on his shirt, coleoptera, yes, and phasmida, which are walking sticks. And he's just a very knowledgeable resource, and he doesn't get paid to volunteer in that capacity, but he does all the time. And every time I tag him, he is always there to make an identification. So it is my pleasure to introduce Joshua Byrne as our speaker today. We're so lucky to have him. Come on up. Yes. All right. And I think you're going to be speaking. Is your mic on?
I'm about to turn it on.
Okay. All right. So I'm going
To minimize that mic interference.
to.
Thank you so much, Amberly. Yeah, it was really fun to see you in person. Uh, I am extremely honored to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, and that this many of you came to listen to a talk about some of the most important but least appreciated animals in our world today. There's honestly a long-standing war between insects and plants. They've been at each other's throats, eating each other, and trying to not be eaten by one another for so many millennia. And I'm here today as a emissary of peace to try to produce some goodwill between the insect people and the plant people, because ultimately they need each other, they help each other, they have co-evolved and made these associations that are often still mysterious to us, but that are a fundamental part of their lives every day. And so we're going to look into how insects and plants interact. Those native insects to Texas with native plants to Texas are going to be our focus today. And I am really excited to talk about it because just yesterday, I was at the hardware store getting stuff for my own garden. I'm working on a native plant landscape in my front yard with rocks and succulents and redbud tree that I'm very excited about. And I was going along noticing how many chemicals emphasized that they just kill every bug. They're like, oh my gosh, we kill 250 different species of insects. Like, great, you're celebrating that? Like, you are doing so much harm to what could be a vibrant and multifaceted ecosystem, and instead it's now just one half of that partnership. It's plants without their insects. And what we're going to look at today is how a thriving community of insects can be an asset to any garden, any ecosystem. Of course, sometimes control methods have to happen. I am not a pest control specialist. I'm mainly a behaviorist and ecologist. And so I'm not going to answer that many pest control advice questions very well at the end of this. If you have them, you can definitely ask me and we'll see if I happen to know. But otherwise, I would love to answer questions once we get through our presentation. If there's anything on your mind that you're thinking about insects as we go through here, we will have some time afterward for that. But I think we should get started talking about bugs and what they're doing for us out there. So like I'd said, insects and plants are often better together, which is paradoxical because insects eat plants a lot. It's a really complicated relationship that has existed through years and years of both natural and human-induced change. And insects, they are not smart enough to realize that they need to be taking care of the plants. But by their own life cycles, by what ends up being most advantageous to them, and the forces of weather and other animals, and the plant's own inherent desire to grow and reproduce, it ends up becoming a surprisingly balanced system. And most of us in the room probably are mainly plant people. We love being surrounded by plants. We try to nurture plants in our yards, both native and probably non-native, and we get a lot of things from them, whether that's joy or vegetables, or not necessarily to mow all the time, but things to do, and we think of insects in the context of plants. We're like, oh, why are there these holes in my beautiful ornamental plant? What is eating the vegetables that I was going to eat? Why are these ugly brown patches on my lawn? And will my neighbors notice? We think of insects as usually problems. That's when they make themselves known to us. It's when they've done something significant to the things we're paying attention to. I am coming from usually the opposite perspective. I raise insects both professionally and at home. I do insect education with kids, and my bugs are my pets. Every day I go in and check on all the bugs and give them what they need. And I tend to think of plants in the context of insects. I think, I want to find this bug. What plants should I be looking for it on? Or I want to set up my terrarium. What do I need to plant in there in order to give the best home for this insect? And so I also have a pretty one-sided view naturally, unless I really stretch myself. But I think that we both can end up with a much more pleasing and much more full view of nature when we take that combination of insects and plants and get to see it as a really beautiful system. So, this is how I imagine it going whenever that monarch visits that flower. The plant can say, hey, I know you just ate a bunch of my leaves earlier. That kind of hurt, but thank you for the work you're doing now. So before we talk about those actual insects and those actual plants, we should talk about the larger geographic context of where we are. I am from Iowa, which is in a lot of ways kind of a biodiversity desert. Iowa used to be a really vibrant prairie, have all sorts of forests and some stream ecosystems and, great nature like all the rest of the United States. But a lot of Iowa has been transformed into monocultures. It's been transformed into cornfields and pig fields. And so growing up, I was always jealous of the other states that had all these different types of habitat and these amazing insects. Whenever we'd take family vacations, I was looking for bugs. I was trying to get outside whenever possible. And so since moving to Texas as an adult, my ability to now drive to like 10 different habitat types within an hour from Fort Worth is the greatest thing. I'm never bored here anymore. And so Texas, it is one of the most biodiverse states by far. We have been seriously blessed with a gigantic tract of land that spans mountains and deserts and swamps and coasts and all different types of forests and prairies. It is arguably the most biodiverse state, and especially as people continue to investigate those habitats in Texas and look for more species, we may top California. We may be even more biodiverse than that other gigantic state. Now, the DFW area is historically a mainly grassland sort of environment. There's a lot of plants like bluestem and buffalo grass that grow really well here on these flat plains, relatively like a prairie savanna sort of habitat. And we also have plenty of forests in Northeast Texas too. Some of those are going to be within DFW still. Some of those are going to be like the hill country further south. This graph does a really amazing job of showing the different habitat types spread across Texas. But in each of those habitat types, there are going to be assemblages of animals as well. And some animals are better adapted to move between habitat types than others, but by and large, a lot of them are going to be pretty specific to that area. The prairie in northern Texas is going to look pretty different than the prairie in southern Texas because they are separated by habitat types that are not the same. They prevent animals from moving between those habitat types a lot of the time. And so the insects that you see, they're going to vary pretty widely across those ecoregions. And especially with little isolated patches of habitat in western Texas, like around Big Bend National Park, around the Davis Mountains, you're going to get animals that are only found in one specific region. In Northeast Texas, we don't tend to have that much endemism or being only found in one area, but we still have a lot of very unique animals that you can find if you get out to the outskirts of the city with a big net or start looking around for those insects. Now, unfortunately, uh, people, we live in cities, and animals do not often do very well in those cities. And so a lot of DFW has been transformed into the metro area, which suits us really great, but we need to remember how to make that accessible and travelable by animals too. So city environments really heavily favor certain types of organisms, really tolerant generalist animals that are able to deal with a lot of different conditions, that usually reproduce quickly, are usually very adaptable, not reliant on a single type of plant, not reliant on a single pattern of weather. Those are usually things that do great in cities. We can think of like bluebottle flies and crows and rabbits, not what we would think as wildlife watching sorts of fauna, but they're going to be the most common things in the cities and often the animals that we see every day. Cities are also really unique habitats in their own for animals that travel with humans. Cockroaches, great example of that. The American cockroach is not from America, but they have traveled with humans to now live on pretty much every continent outside of Antarctica. And Fort Worth, as great as it is for biodiversity compared to Iowa, living in the city here, I still sometimes am hard pressed to find really great biodiverse areas. Now, we are really fortunate, though, to have a lot of parks spread out, a lot of relatively wild areas still, and a variety of insects that might live there or still find ways to survive and even move between those habitats. A lot of the time, though, insects are restricted to those areas. A place like River Legacy Park is going to have tons of different insects, really, really biodiverse habitat there, many different habitat types in a small area. And the animals that live there, they will be reproducing, moving around, acting as they would in an undisturbed habitat. The issue, though, is that the land surrounding River Legacy Park is not that same type of habitat. And insects that emigrate from there, that leave their natural, the range that they grew up and look for other habitats, they will often end up hit by a car or sprayed by pesticide in someone's lawn. A lot of the time, those animals are unable to move between habitats. And moving between habitats is important for gene flow. It's important for those populations to be able to mix and for those animals to be able to spread out. So that is where we all come in. As people interested in creating habitat for animals that is also really pleasing to our eyes in our yards, outside of our homes, or in our natural areas, we are the enablers for those animal populations to be able to spread, grow, move around. And insects are the easiest animals for us to impact in that way. You can get so many families of butterflies in one adult human backyard. You can't get that many families of deer in there. So insects, by virtue of their smaller size, they are able to use our yards as maybe stopping points, maybe several generation homes as they move around between the more major habitats of Fort Worth. And so that's something that I'm looking forward to doing, is seeing what is in my area already that ends up in my yard over the years and how my yard might be able to be a resource for those animals. Birds, lizards, frogs, turtles, all those other animals are going to be doing the same thing, emigrating from those natural areas and sometimes finding some respite from the city around our homes. So I love just being conscious of them and knowing that I'm doing a little good thing for all those animals. Now, we should talk about the ways that insects impact plants. And I've split it up today into 5 general categories. Now, there are plenty of very specific ways that insects impact plants, certain species, and certain plants. But today, we're going to start off with sort of a general flyover of herbivory, of eating those plants, of carnivory, eating other animals, of cycling nutrients through the habitat, of affecting the composition of the soil, and finally, the thing that we are probably all pretty well acquainted with already, pollination, one of the most fascinating interrelationships in nature. So we're going to talk about these things. We're going to see some animals that are representative of pretty common, pretty impactful Northeast Texas fillers of these roles. And we will also get into a few specific examples where I can really go in depth and highlight some of the great like Texas long-lasting relationships that we get to see in our own backyards. So let's talk about the big elephant in the room, herbivory, eating plants. Now, the first sentence right here is a contradiction to a lot of us. The diversity of a plant assemblage can often be increased by herbivores. The presence of animals eating plants will often increase the overall health of a plant ecosystem. And on the surface, that doesn't make any sense at all. But we can think about it from the context of those plants. They are built to survive. They are built to grow more when we prune them. They're built to spread via their roots when the foliage above is under attack. And a lot of people have looked into this and tried to find out exactly the mechanisms by which herbivores can positively impact plants. There was a great case study in this by a couple researchers, Carson and Root in 2000, on goldenrod. Goldenrod's that really common field plant with the big yellow firework sprays of flowers over there on the left. And the great thing about this study is that it is over a long period of time, over 10 years. If you just look at plants in the period of 1 or 2 years, that individual weather of those years or an unusually high population of a certain animal can really impact it and skew those results. But over 10 years, you get some very consistent information. And so Carson and Root's experiment basically took the form of suppressing the insects in certain plots of grassland versus allowing insects from the surrounding area to freely move about in that grassland and eat the plants. And they observed that the plots with the insects suppressed showed significantly larger goldenrod plants and far more of them, about 80% more in some plots than those exposed to leaf beetles. Now, we would take that and we would think, okay, the plants are obviously benefiting from the lack of insects. But where there's 80% more goldenrod, what does that mean is not living in that space? It's all those other plants. And so the plants that did not invest into defenses from insect herbivores, into their ability to withstand, the chewing, the leaf mining, and the root cropping, those are the things that get to spread freely when they're not being eaten. Goldenrod is delicious to insects. If it doesn't have anything keeping it down, it's going to spread and crowd out all those other plants that have invested in their defenses. This relates to something called the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, which is that insects that eat specific plants, they will suppress those seedlings of the plants that are closest to the reproducing parent plant. They're going to make it spread out. You've got your host tree with a lot of herbivores on it, and all the seedlings that try to grow up underneath it are really easy pickings for the herbivores. But when seedlings start to grow further away, make a more spread out, more diverse array of plants, they do a lot better because they're not close to those large concentrations of herbivores. And so when a plant is very dense, the survival of additional individuals of that plant actually decreases. And so non-native species, though, they don't often work this way. The emerald ash borer, really infamous example of an insect that doesn't end up caring about the density of its host plant and actually eradicates the ash trees across where it's found. It doesn't have the pressure from predators like the leaf beetles that were feeding on the goldenrod in this experiment. So this is something where when we're dealing with animals that have grown up around those plants, that diverse assemblage of herbivores is often beneficial. But when people have messed with it through bringing species where they didn't originally occur, that's when we do hear about the really high profile examples of plants being wiped out fully by insects. It's not supposed to be that way, though. So here are some examples of some really valuable herbivores that we see all around Texas. Have any of y'all seen the red katydid up on the top left? This is a pretty unique katydid species from south central Texas, lives up in the trees, and they go through periodic outbreaks where they will partially defoliate trees, and then they are subsequently eaten by the birds, the squirrels, the lizards, all the other animals around there. They go in a boom, there's millions and millions of them, to a bust. And they're really a dramatic example of how native animal populations are really kept in check by those predators, diseases, parasites. Even if it seems overwhelming, the plants are built to deal with 1 or 2 bad years of red katydids. And by defoliating those trees, the katydids allow a lot more sunlight to get through to the lower plants, give them the chance to really sprout up and grow really big that year. And the parent trees, well, they can deal with losing a lot of their leaves in 1 year. Grasshoppers are great examples of generalist herbivores. They'll eat a little of everything. Grasshoppers want a varied diet. They're not going to eat the same plant day in, day out, unless they're forced to. And so when they exist in an area, they will broadly suppress a lot of those plants. And they're going to eat the yummiest stuff that comes up really commonly and have a lesser impact on those rarer plants in general. You do get some species specialists, insects that they'll starve to death if they don't get their only favorite plant. I couldn't live that way. I love a lot of different foods. But the striped leaf beetles in the genus Trirabda are really interesting looking little guys that occur in a lot of similar looking species that focus on one plant per species a lot of the time. They were the main subject of the goldenrod experiment, where Trirabda will grow to enormous populations when goldenrod really takes over. And then the next year, as there's less goldenrod, there will be less of them. And their population will follow the increase and decrease in the abundance of their food plant. And then I just thought this was a fun one to add in here as well. This is the enemy of my enemy. This is the poison ivy sawfly. A lot of us will look at poison ivy and other really noxious plants and think there is just no use for this. Like, why is this here? But even really noxious plants like that have their defenses overcome by certain insects. And so if populations of those sawflies are wiped out by using broad spectrum insecticides, things like that, a lot of the time those really well defended and often really hazardous to us plants are going to be some of the first ones to come back because they can resist most of the herbivores, and that specific one that used to keep them in check would no longer be there. They also look really darn cool. I've only seen a couple wild ones, but they're so cool. Now, next, we should talk about carnivory. We've already alluded to the populations of predators keeping the populations of herbivores in check. This one's a little bit more obvious how it might benefit plants. But I still think it's really helpful, especially for a lot of us who are biologically control-minded. We want to use sustainable methods to protect our plants. And so it's best for us to know those carnivorous insects who are going to move in and thrive in our yards too. So insect herbivores, for all the good that they can bring, they do destroy plants if they're not controlled. The insects just don't have a real understanding of conservation like we do. But other insects are often their most common and efficient predators. Sometimes they're really heavily specialized to be able to take down certain insects that very few other animals can. Up here is a great example of that, the wheel bug. Raise your hand if you've ever seen one of these. Yeah, in East Texas, this is a really formidable, one of the largest assassin bugs in the United States. And even the name assassin bug, it's like, they mean business. The wheel bug has a long, extremely sharp proboscis that's armored all along the length, and at its end, it has a little hypodermic needle that it can use to inject paralyzing saliva. And it's like the mouth parts made into a tube. So like a butterfly has a proboscis that it will stick into a plant and suck nectar like a straw. The wheel bug will use its proboscis or rostrum to stab into an insect and suck out the juice. And wheel bugs are all about getting through the armor of very well-defended insects. This prey is the puss moth or the asp, the extremely painful stinging caterpillar that almost no animal wants to mess with. And wheel bugs, with their long armored stab mouth, are really good at getting between those bristles and taking out that animal that Otherwise, almost nothing will eat. And so getting a variety of insects to thrive in our yards often means that those really noxious species that the birds, the mice, the lizards don't want to eat, those insects are going to be able to keep them down. Parasitoids, which we'll talk about a bit more later, are the most species-specific predators. These are those insects that will lay eggs in and develop inside another insect, which is a really fascinating bunch of life cycles that they have. We'll get into them a little bit more later. One of my favorite things, though, about carnivorous insects as they relate to plants is that plants will actually communicate with them. Some of us may know already about how plants communicate with one another, how trees will send signals to other trees through their roots and be able to send signals about the composition of nutrients or preparing for winter. Plants can communicate with one another in ways that we never would have guessed just a few decades ago. But plants will also communicate with insects. And when plants are injured via the mechanical chewing of an insect or getting a disease constructed by an insect, they will often release volatile chemicals. And those chemicals are picked up on by the antennae, which insects use to smell, of all sorts of carnivores. And now those insects, as they get the chemical signals from the plant, they're attracted to that plant where usually they'll find their host. For instance, a caterpillar chewing on the plant, its saliva is going to induce the plant to release those volatile chemicals. And then the wasp that specifically hunts those caterpillars has evolved to be able to smell and respond to that chemical signal. This is reliant on native species. Insects that are moved from one place to another are not going to recognize the chemical signals of plants that they have not grown up around. And so sometimes, we think it's a great idea to buy, for instance, that praying mantis egg case from the garden store and release it into our yard. But most of the time, those mantises, they're not native to that area. They're not going to navigate those plants as correctly and not be a great source of pest control. But those native predators that might live in the yards nearby or the creek behind the house, they're going to be able to respond and get to those plants that are suffering and find just a wealth of food for them right there. A lot of those carnivorous insects, they are generalists. They might still respond to those injured plant signals, but not as strongly as these specific ones. So here are some really famous predators. We've already talked about the wheelbug. This is what a juvenile wheelbug looks like. I probably answer 100 ID requests for wheelbugs on Ant-Man's Hill every year. They are, people see that and it's a real curiosity. They can also bite very painfully. So don't grab one. They don't want to bite you, but just let them stay where they are. In the middle, right, there's the cicada killer. This is a really imposing wasp that hunts cicadas. They're going to have a great year this year. But this is another example, I think, of one of the benefits of carnivorous insects in our yards that we don't often think about. And that's getting to live in a little mini nature documentary. How many of y'all like to watch Planet Earth and other documentaries featuring just incredible footage of animals hunting one another, animals trying to defend themselves? Well, we can see that in our own yards if we just look a little smaller. And I will never forget the time I was leading a summer camp. Kids, we were talking about predation. We were talking about animals, their defensive behaviors and such. And as we were walking around outside, we heard a scream coming from the trees of a cicada and saw a cicada killer moving through the tree branches in pursuit of this cicada. And when it caught it, they dropped to the ground and all the kids gathered around a big circle and we watched the two of them wrestle until the cicada killer had stung and paralyzed the cicada. And then she picked it up and flew over the kids' heads with this bug that weighed twice as much as she did. And they were all so amazed. They got to see a predator-prey interaction, like an epic battle happening right in front of them. And so I think it really drove home the message to that camp, that all these insects, they're doing these incredible things day by day. And we can often feature them in our own yards if we just allow that little space. And then over there on the left is the caterpillar hunter. This is a pretty diverse group of beetles in the genus Calosima. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and colors. But one of the most beautiful is that fiery searcher caterpillar hunter that we see in Texas. These are extremely effective pest control to the point that Some of their cousins were introduced to combat the spongy moth, formerly called the gypsy moth, in the northern United States. They were an example of a successful use of biological control, where they were brought from an area where they were native to the gypsy moth new habitat, and were able to reduce the populations of those caterpillars dramatically. In Texas, caterpillar hunters are native and they help to prevent outbreaks of certain caterpillars, even really well defended ones. They help to make sure that those trees are not getting defoliated by the tent caterpillars, by the Luna moth caterpillars, and their larvae up at the top are another really common ID request that I answer all the time. So here is where I want to go a little bit in depth and talk about wasps some more. Wasps are those insects that I can often get people to say, hey, Josh, I'm on board with most bugs. I can appreciate a mantis or a rhino beetle, but wasps are my nemesis. I've had people say this to me. And I'm here to say they're really important. They are often inconvenient to us. They're occasionally dangerous to us, but the roles that wasps play as far as suppressing herbivores are almost unparalleled in the insect world. Now, a lot of wasps function a lot like songbirds, where the adults are basically herbivores. They're going to drink nectar from plants, they're going to eat fruit, but their young are really ravenous carnivores. And so, like a robin pulling worms out of the ground to feed her babies, she's not going to eat those herself. Adult wasps will hunt tirelessly to gather crickets and katydids and caterpillars to bring home to feed their babies in their nest. Uh, these are some paper wasps here, some really common Texas animals. This red paper wasp is probably one of the most hated species in Texas if people that I've talked to are any reliable source. But these paper wasps, not only are they pretty effective pollinators, but they are incredibly effective hunters. And we can thank them for a lot of the orchards of trees that produce tons of fruit, the blueberries that we'll go out and pick in the summer. Those orchards are, if they're not protected by pesticides, they are protected by wasps, who can eat thousands and thousands of caterpillars over a season. Each individual nest is going to produce hundreds of wasps, and each of those wasps needed to eat dozens of smaller insects in order to get to that size. Now, paper wasps are insects that are potentially going to actually come after us. We do need to keep in mind that not all native species get along great underneath the eaves of our house or maybe on our patio chairs. And getting rid of wasps is a whole other topic. But if we see them in our yards, we can thank them for that pollination, and we can know that as long as that nest isn't where people are going to contact it, a wasp away from her nest doesn't want anything to do with you. Now, wasps are also some of the most diverse insects on the planet. Beetles, as far as we know, are the most. I mean, we can fill a whole room of shirts with beetles. But wasps rival them. There's an estimated about 350,000 species of wasps in the world, and the vast majority of those are solitary parasitoids, like this tiny little assassin. She is, in this picture, extending her abdomen to lay an egg inside that aphid, which will soon swell up like this one, a husk of its former self, which currently houses a wasp pupa. The baby wasps will develop inside that aphid and hatch out, and over just a few weeks, these rapidly developing tiny, tiny wasps are able to bring an aphid population from the thousands down to the single digits. You'll often see this if you don't treat aphids in your yard, that they won't be there the next time you check on that plant because natural enemies like lacewings, ladybugs, and parasitoid wasps make short work of them. Hornworms are another really common target of parasitoid wasps that we'll see, as well as a lot of wood-boring beetles. They are really, really good at getting to prey that's hidden inside like the core of a tree or deep underground. Those parasitoid wasps are incredibly sensitive to their chemical signatures. These are often the responders of those injured plants, are animals like parasitoid wasps. And they're some of the smallest insects around. A lot of them barely even have wings. They just get carried by the wind like little plankton, and all the wings are supposed to do is steer them to get where they want to go. So we've talked about predators for a while, and I think we should move on to a little bit more peaceful of a topic. This is, oh, are we moving? Nutrient cycling. Now, we've talked about how insects are some of the best control of insects because they can get to places that other animals cannot, and they can eat things that other animals often don't want to. And both of those skills are also incredibly useful for insects converting waste material from the environment into usable material for other creatures and for plants. Insects will consume dead plant and animal matter and convert it into frass, which is the scientific way to say bug poop. And frass is phenomenal fertilizer. It's often really rich in nitrogen, it's rich in free and digestible molecules where maybe the thing that they once ate was completely indigestible, something like lignin, the wood in plant tissues. Nutrients that are trapped in there become available for use by other organisms after they go through the gut of a lot of these specialist insects. There's a great quote by this guy who heads the Ecdysis Project. He's trying to advocate for insect diversity to be preserved on farmland and in all sorts of like agricultural settings. And he says the number of insect species on your farm directly correlates with how much profit you generate. A lot of that is because those plants are going to get fertilized without any cost from you by that diverse community of insects, which is transforming useless material into beneficial soil molecules. This example right here, that's the larva of a stag beetle. Stags are not very common in Texas. We don't have the really dense old growth forest to support them in many places. But especially in Arkansas, where I spent a lot of time, the stag beetles were some of the best decomposers in those old growth forests. They'd take care of a big fallen tree in just a few decades, transform that tree back into soil. And in Texas, we can find all sorts of C-shaped white grubs, especially when we're turning through a compost pile or lifting up a dead log in the woods. Those C-shaped white grubs are animals like rhinoceros beetles and green June beetles, and they'll often perform that exact same function. So these are some of our diligent detritivores, hard at work, eating junk and turning it into free money. We've got our ox beetle, one of the most magnificent South Texas beetles that has a few representatives in Fort Worth. Really have to look for them though. The American burying beetle is a unique example as it is both an endangered insect. Not very many insects are high profile enough to make it onto the endangered species list. And it's also an example of an insect which will pair bond, a lot like a bird. Male and female will work together to bury the carcass of a small animal underground and feed their young with it. And being buried underground is the perfect place for those nutrients to go into roots as well, once the insect family is done with it. We also have tons of non-insect detritivores, animals like springtails and millipedes. They do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to converting that nutrients, bringing it around underground. As those millipedes dig many feet long tunnels underground, they're going to move nutrients from that dead tree all across the yard as they travel, as they defecate. It's sort of like seed dispersal, but for nutrients. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they can vary. Oh, that's right. Yeah, she asked, what kinds of organisms is the American burying beetle burying? Thank you for reminding me to repeat the question. Um, a lot of the time, they will bury surprisingly large animals for their size. The beetle is about 1.5 inches long. They'll bury small birds up to the size of even like a quail or songbird. They'll bury mice. I don't think they go for herps very much. I feel like they mostly bury warm-blooded animals. Herps would be reptiles and amphibians. That's right. They are burying them once they're already dead. This is also an insect really heavily impacted by poisons. That's one of the reasons that they're endangered, is if that mouse dies from poison, the burying beetles that then bury it and eat its carcass will also often die afterward. So they're one of those reasons to be conscious of poison use. So now, similarly to nutrient cycling, I want to talk a little bit about soil construction. y'all probably know a lot more about soil than I do. That is really the foundation of what you're doing every day. And apparently in June, it's sexy. I'm kind of interested in that. That's not what I was thinking looking at that. Um, yeah, I kind of want to see what that's all about. But we're going to talk about soil construction and how insects really impact that. So, one of the principal things that humans do with soil is that we till it. We want to rake a hoe through the soil. Maybe that's where it's sexy. We want to rake a hoe through the soil and move the elements that are on the top down to the bottom, that are on the bottom up to the top. We want to put down topsoil and add a nutritious layer of soil on top of what was nutritionally more barren. And insects are doing this for us in natural environments all the time. Ants are the primary engineers of the soil, especially in the more arid parts of the country like Texas. Ant colonies can move about 800 kilograms of soil each year per hectare. That's from a study in Florida, which has a lot of the same ant species as Texas. Especially in those dry environments of the Southwest, ants are going to be some of the largest sort of biomass animals available. There are not going to be that many burrowing mammals in the really hard packed soil. There's not going to be large herbivores in the more arid Southwest. It's going to be the ants who are eating a large amount of those plants. And as they move seeds and plant matter down underground, and as they dig their really, really deep nests and bring soil particles up to the top, they will just completely upturn the soils in those regions where their colonies are. And the colonies can be massive. Some ant colonies in the United States even can reach up to 8 meters deep. And so they're bringing nutrients that were sitting unused, buried underground, up to the top where they can be reactivated and bringing stuff from the surface down to the bottom. They just help to equalize that whole soil composition. Some people have even investigated more specifically with land plots grown with ant colonies and found that plants in those plots have larger root systems and taller greenery than plants grown in identical plots nearby, but where ants were controlled. Other tunneling insects are impactful as well. Animals like beetles, mole crickets, they're also going to irrigate and aerate and unpack those really dense soils to allow the roots to have the healthiest growing environment. And also as they feed, as they excrete, they're going to spread around nutrients too. Here's some examples of engineers of the earth that we have in Texas. Dung beetles, a lot like the burying beetles, are going to take organic waste from the top of the soil, put it a couple feet underground. And they also don't eat the entire dung ball. They're going to leave some material behind just as part of their natural life cycle. And that material, perfect to get used for plants. And the tunnels that they dig, going to get filled up with water and bring water down to the bottom of that soil column where plant roots that go really deep can access it. Harvester ants, seriously, it's mostly ants that are doing the soil construction work here. Harvester ants are some of our more common species in Texas. You can see these at all sorts of parks. If you go around to places with a lot of yucca, a lot of mesquite, a lot of like grasses, those harvester ants are going to be really common on that sandy soil. And actually termites as well. As undesirable as termites are around our houses, they are extremely desirable in places like forests, where they can bridge that gap between those dead trees that are being decomposed and the soil underneath that really needs those nutrients. So now the moment we've all been waiting for, probably, pollination, one of the greatest interactions between insects and plants that happens every day, and that a lot of our educational facilities at the Botanic Garden are built around. I expect that you know the basic workings of pollination. Pollen from one plant, from one flower taken to another flower, where it can fertilize those ovaries, produce those seeds and fruit. Uh, we generally learn how this works. We often learn in elementary school how this works. But what we often don't learn is how many animals are responsible for pollination and how oftentimes plants have extremely specific flowers that are made to be pollinated by extremely specific animals. There's a lot of very tiny flowers, little ground cover plants that cannot be effectively pollinated by the honeybees and bumblebees that we usually think of as the champions of pollination. Instead, those tiny plants rely on animals like ants, flies, even crickets and cockroaches, like this pale bordered field roach in the middle, are surprisingly effective pollinators. Some plants even go above and beyond and provide food and shelter for their pollinators. These beetles up here, Kern's flower scarabs, are really common in South Texas and occasionally seen in Fort Worth. And they will spend their entire day inside cactus flowers. They get a lot of protection from predators there. They're brightly colored little guys, but they can get into the cup-like, very deep cactus flower, cover themselves in pollen, basically get camouflage. And they find their mates there. They sleep there. They'll move around between the flowers of cacti and be enormously effective pollinators because the plant has given them everything they could possibly want. Non-native plants, they also benefit from a diversity of pollinators. Pollinators are often not going to be too picky. You know, if the plant has nectar, it's sugar. They want it. And so even if they're made to pollinate certain types of plants, a lot of pollinators will still have some flexibility. One study on apple orchards observed trees being pollinated by around 25 species of bees and flies. And those trees produced about 3 times more fruit than trees that were self-pollinated. This is, you know, a lot of trees are capable of self-pollinating if they don't have pollinators, or we can do it for them. But we can save a lot of work by allowing insects to do this as well. And insects are often really thorough pollinators. All those hairs on their bodies are great receptacles for pollen. And even insects that don't have a ton of visible hair, you can see the little yellow grains on these ants. They've got enough bristles that they're just small enough, it's going to stick to them no matter what. Here are some of our pollinators. We've got tons of bees, tons of native bees, unlike honeybees, that efficiently pollinate a wide variety of flowers. The longhorned bee on the top is one that we see pretty often. The males do a lot of pollinating, which is really neat. And then there's this, I don't know what its actual name is, so I'm calling it the never skip leg day bee, which just insanely jacked. But a lot of the time, those native bees are very specific in the habitats where they like to live. They are not cared for as directly by people as animals like honeybees and even bumblebees. And so these guys are some of the first to disappear when habitats are overrun by concrete and pesticides. And they're some of the most important. We've also got some fuzzy beetles, additional cute representatives like the bumbleflower scarab and the harlequin scarab, two really cool Texas natives that are often going to be found burying their faces in plants and just getting a lot of pollen on them as they do. And then butterflies and moths. These are our go-to examples of pollination next to bees. They are not as good at it as we would think, but a lot of flowers are made specifically for butterflies to pollinate them. Plants that have flowers with this sort of wide table-like petal setup, great for a big butterfly to spread its legs out on to sit for a while and drink nectar, and they are made to be pollinated by animals like swallowtails. Moths will pollinate flowers that open at night a lot of the time. We may not see them as well, but night opening plants are really common both in rainforests and in deserts, where moths and bats are going to do a lot of that pollination. And moths are the topic of, I think, one of the coolest and most intricate interactions in Texas. Raise your hand if you have ever heard of the yucca moth. Quite a few of us. Did somebody beat me to a presentation about them? Ooh, this is a really cool example because most animals pollinate on accident. They're getting that nectar. The pollen happens to them whether they want it to or not. Sometimes the plant will even, have something that slaps the pollen on them as they leave the flower. But the yucca moth is specially made to be able to intentionally pollinate yucca flowers. They have this really close mutualism such that they are the only animal which can pollinate a lot of yuccas. And they intentionally pollinate it to increase its seed crop to feed their young. What yucca moths do after they reach maturity is that they go up and find the flower of a yucca. They use their modified mouth parts, we'll often call them tentacles. They just harvest this pollen and hold it up close to their face, pack it into a big ball. Then they'll move to another flower and find the style and pack that pollen deep inside and cause the plant to produce a really large amount of seeds, far more seeds than the yucca moth needs to eat. They lay eggs in the ovary of the flower that they pollinate, and the bright red larvae will eat some, but not all of the seeds. The plants do have a way of responding if yucca moths get over enthusiastic and multiple moths try to lay eggs in plants that one moth has already pollinated, and the yucca will actually drop off its flower and sort of punish those moths for over colonizing the one flower. Long enough time of doing this has made yucca moths usually avoid flowers that have already been pollinated. And so that really incentivizes them to pollinate as many of the flowers of the yucca as possible and maximize its overall seed production. And so both parties really benefit from this mutualism, where the moth is protected by the cup-shaped hanging flowers. It has a completely reliable food source that it doesn't need to do hardly any work for, and the plant received some of the most efficient pollination that it could ask for. So examples like this, oh, we can take some more at the end, we're almost done. Examples like this are really the bedrock of this science. There's all sorts of interactions that may not be as extremely specialized as these, but are still occurring that we have not even looked at yet, as far as animals that coordinate their development to match the blooming of the plants around them, or that are made to be able to camouflage best on the plants where they live and in turn help out. But unfortunately, there are a lot of present threats to insect diversity, some of which are currently worsening. You may have seen headlines about global insect decline, and that is a real thing around the world that is often affecting not just the abundance of insects, but the diversity. Some of those sampled sites actually have pretty similar abundance of insects. Say you've got 8,000 insects that are collected in that sample. Maybe in past decades, those 8,000 insects would be 200 different species. But today we're seeing a great reduction in the number of species, even if the number of insects total might be similar. And that is really negative for the plant communities because of how specialized a lot of those plants are to rely on certain species of insects. If those pollinators or those defenders of the plants go, the plant community is going to suffer as well. And native insects are often the victims of human activities that are not even targeting them, that we do without thinking about those insects that are getting caught in the crossfire. Things like conversion of land to monocultures, whether that's a lawn entirely of Kentucky bluegrass or a field entirely of corn, monocultures tend to be really hostile to animal diversity, especially when they're paired with regular and widespread pesticide use. Introduced species, animals like fire ants, plants like giant reed, they're going to take habitat and resources from the animals that were originally there, and in some cases will directly oppose those animals. Things like the fire ants, which will kill native ant species and turn an area into just a monopoly of fire ants. So the personal choices that we make, things like how we maintain our yards, the things that we advocate for, they can have really visible local effects. But honestly, systemic human change, which I am not prepared to talk about today, is necessary to solve the largest problems. But some of those personal things that we can do include including insects in our daily lives, including insects in the way that we talk about nature to the people that we get to meet. When we are volunteering at the Botanic Garden, sometimes it just something as simple as pointing out that cool bug while you're talking about the plant, maybe sharing something about how it's impacting that plant or the beneficial things that it's doing, that can have a huge effect on kids who are getting all their cues from how to perceive nature from us. We can really be leaders in creating appreciation for insects in the people that we run into. And so we have found, especially like for me in the zoo field, we found that people are highly motivated to conserve animals that they care about. If they don't care, if they don't think that animal is a net negative, they are not going to want to donate money or time to help protect it. But when we end up teaching kids all about how valuable those insects are, how fascinating they are, we can raise a generation of people who care about protecting biodiversity. And when insects are protected, a lot of the time, all those other animals, their benefits are going to follow. All those songbirds and frogs that would eat those insects, they are going to benefit from those increased populations too. And there are numerous frontiers of professional study that you might be interested in, as well as citizen science projects, things like iNaturalist that I'm sure you're all well aware of, and bio blitzes and things like that, where you can get in touch with your local insect populations. And the way that I love to end presentations for kids, as well as for adults, is to say that if you appreciate insects, you are never going to get bored. There's just too many of them. You're always around something interesting. So I really appreciate y'all coming today. And I would love to take some more questions, which I will be sure to repeat for the Zoom audience too. Oh, oh, great. Yeah. Um, all righty. So if you've got a question, you can just raise your hand. I'll go to you. We've got, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that on Friday, May 10th, at the Sherry Tea Party, they're having
Oh, that's so cool.
in the last year.
Gotcha. That is awesome. Gotcha. Yeah, so she told us about the Yucca Moth Walk at, where was it again? Gotcha. Sherry K. Hart Nature Oh, a part. Sorry, Nature Preserve. Um, I had never heard of a yucca moth walk before. Is that where you learned about them at first?
Yes.
That's sweet. Yeah. Being such a tiny moth, they will often go unnoticed by us. I mean, we have probably walked past hundreds of them in our lifetimes. But that is so cool that there's something specifically to appreciate those guys. Yeah. What was his name? I actually don't. I not ringing a bell right now. Okay. Doug Tallamy. Gotcha. Fantastic. Doug Tallamy. I will have to look that up. Is he around Fort Worth? Oh, how cool. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, that Doug Tallamy, entomologist from Delaware, who is focused on bringing native plants into our yards to benefit the animal communities. That absolutely sounds like someone I need to know about. Bringing Nature Home is the title of the book. Thank you. That's sweet. Yeah. My favorite bugs is the order Mantodia, the praying mantises. These are animals we didn't talk about a lot here. They are generalist predators, and most frequently, the way that I'll connect them to biodiversity is by saying that mantises are not good pest control. They are generalist predators. They're going to eat everything they can get their claws on, including each other, and that means they usually occur at pretty low densities and are not going to target a specific insect pest that you might want to get control for them. But mantises are incredible in a lot of ways. They are mostly what I raise at home, what I keep as pets and education animals. And I've actually got a friend doing research on analyzing mantis dung to learn about the insect community that's in that area that is difficult to sample. Because the mantises are eating a wide variety of animals, that DNA being contained in their dung. And so he actually will go out, collect mantises from different habitats, and then search for the DNA barcodes of different species in their waste and find out about the insect community in that area. And so they are really interesting animals, great ambassador insects, but I didn't get to focus on them a lot today. If we want to do a mantis PowerPoint another day, I will happily come back. Yeah, and then I'll come to you. Oh my goodness. Amberly brought up the fact that mantises, one of the only insects in the United States capable of eating vertebrates, like hummingbirds. This is something that is really viral. there are many, many more posts on the internet about it than there are hummingbirds that get eaten by mantises. This is a pretty uncommon occurrence, and it is not only something that native or that non-native mantises will do. Even though our non-native mantises are much larger than our native ones in Texas, the native species like Stagmomantis limbata, the bordered mantis, are capable of bringing down adult hummingbirds, and they'll do this on occasion. Hummingbirds have evolved with this pressure. But honestly, a lot of the time humans make it worse because our hummingbird feeders that are not regularly maintained become places that mantises recognize as a reliable source of food. They are smart enough to remember places where they've caught prey, and they'll come back day after day to those hummingbird feeders if we don't pay attention to them. So if you don't want that particular part of the natural cycle of life to happen in your yard, just relocate mantises from those hummingbird feeders, put them somewhere else where they're going to find more prey, and they don't need to take down something that big, and you probably won't have any incidents. Great question. Yeah, what was yours?
What is the purpose of insect scale? The scale insect.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful question. She asked, what is the purpose of scale insects? Yeah, because they do kill plants. Scale insects are a really unique kind of herbivore because they are essentially ticks for plants. They get on there, they suck an insignificant amount of sap individually, but when scale insects proliferate, they can really tax a plant's sap flow, and they also spread plant diseases. Scale insects are, like we talked about with herbivores, how they will reduce the density of a very common plant to then allow other plants to grow up in that space. Scale insects are incredibly effective at spreading plant diseases and bringing down the populations of plants that have become overabundant. You can think of, honestly, like humans, diseases like the Black Plague that hurt a lot of people, killed a lot of people who were very densely packed in Europe hundreds of years ago. When plants are very densely packed, they become far more vulnerable to the transmission of disease. Scale insects and that disease cycle are naturally interrupted by predators, animals like ladybird beetles that are going to be able to chew through that waxy coating and can destroy them in vast numbers like they destroy aphids. And so in areas with intact natural biodiversity, the diseases spread by scale insects, not usually going to be a big issue. However, in your yards, where we are likely to have one plant or 3 plants rather than hundreds of plants, it is really noticeable and really upsetting if scale insects transmit a disease to one of your garden plants. So even though they will naturally be mitigated, they're not going to run rampant and wipe out their host plant species, sometimes natural predators don't get to them fast enough. And that is a pretty common reason for us to intervene in our garden plants, is to prevent them from getting a scale insect transmitted disease. Yeah, scale insects, she asked, will they multiply if they're not killed? Their population locally will be destroyed by predators like wasps and ladybugs, but scale insect babies travel by wind. They are so tiny, they will get blown off the plant and those babies will land, and probably 90% of them will die, but maybe 10% will land on a plant that they can feed on. And so that's how they'll move around. So that population of scale insects, maybe in your yard, it will move with the predators and with the wind as it goes from one plant to another. That's part of how they'll transmit that disease. And so if you are doing a pest control for scale insects, you do want to make sure you're very thorough with getting rid of them. Mhm. Yup. Oh yeah, yeah. Non-native plants, like when people go places where those people are not used to the diseases that we may bring, plants are similar. They come into their area brought by people, and they are unlikely to have defenses against some of those diseases that they'll encounter. So non-native plants are usually less resilient to parasites like scale insects. Anybody else? Yeah. Great question. She asked, do non-native fire ants improve the soil? And the answer is yes, but also no. Uh, fire ants produce tremendous nests. I mean, they will have one nest that covers multiple yards, often multi-queen nests, which makes them really difficult to get rid of. They will also produce giant mounds, and they are legitimately bringing a lot of soil from the lower parts of the ground up to the top when they make that mound, when they dig those tunnels. They are doing some of the work in uh, in tilling the soil like native ants would do. However, fire ants will also reduce the biodiversity in ways that native ants would not, such as by attacking ground nesting birds, by attacking lizard eggs, other ant species, and the ways that they impact plants are often less beneficial to the plants than native ants. And so if you have fire ants, your soil is getting some benefits, but it's probably not as good as if it was a robust community of maybe 5 native ant species instead of the monopoly of fire ants that it would be. I am currently dealing with fire ants in my front yard and trying to get rid of them without spreading poison all around. So if y'all have any tips, I would love to talk about that after this. Great question. Anybody else? We've got a couple more minutes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we'll go with you sitting closer and then you in the back after that. Great, yeah. We can do Zoom questions after these two. Insect fungus interactions. Yeah, I do. I am not as well versed in fungi as I am with plants, and definitely not with plants as I am with insects. But there are a few really unique interactions between insects and fungi, notably insects transporting and propagating fungi. Similar to how we talked about scale insects transporting plant diseases, which is something they do basically accidentally, just like how a mosquito is infected with something and passes it between its hosts. A lot of beetles that tunnel in tree bark and dead wood, sometimes living wood, will intentionally bring with them fungal spores from wood colonizing fungi. And then as they go and infest a new tree, sometimes a healthy tree and other species a dead tree, they will inoculate that tree with the fungi that they bring. And as the fungi spreads through the tree, it becomes more and more palatable for those beetles and their larvae. And so they are responsible sometimes for spreading fungus. You've probably heard of leafcutter ants and how they have specific, essentially domesticated species of fungi that are found pretty much nowhere else besides leafcutter ant colonies. They maintain those fungi. They keep them in these big galleries underground. And when queen leafcutters go to found new colonies, they will first stop by their fungus garden, get some of those fungi into this little pouch in their mouth, and then they fly off and plant it in their new colony. And so there are certain interactions like that where insects will bring fungi with them to make their lives easier to feed them. A lot of the decomposition of wood by beetles that we talked about, like with the stag and rhinoceros beetles destroying dead trees, a lot of that is also eased and made more effective by the action of fungi. I raise rhinoceros beetles. They're part of my hobby, part of my education animals. And when I feed them with wood that is not infused with fungi, the adult beetles turn out a lot smaller, a lot less healthy, because the grub needs to do all that hard work in its gut of digesting the wood, digesting the tree material. But when that wood is really thoroughly broken down already by fungi, the beetle has a much easier life and gets to focus a lot more of its energy in its own bodily growth. And so they'll become a lot bigger and healthier as adults. And so they're capable of decomposing wood, but the action of microorganisms is extremely helpful to those decomposing insects too. Did that satisfy your curiosity? Awesome. Then, yeah, what's that back there? Yeah.
If before then used pesticides, the fire ants were opportunistic, very resilient.
Ah, yeah. Fire ants, he asked if native ants are present in an area if they will hinder the expansion of fire ants, versus if native ants are wiped out, fire ants have an easier time colonizing that area. And that is true. Native ants do put up defense against fire ants, and depending on the species, some of them are quite effective at it. Some of them are able to hold off or defeat fire ant colonies for land, especially in the short term. But fire ants being extremely mobile, they're going to float on rafts when it floods. They're going to spread a lot further than a lot of smaller, like more compact colony native ants. They are able to control that area. And if you have native ants, fire ants may exist and slowly take over land or be restricted to some areas. But if you do have a yard that, is barren of native ants, fire ants are going to move in even faster. It's partly a matter of which species are present, and it's partly a matter of they're going to get there. It just depends on in what quantity and in what speed they're going to get there. That was a really good question. Ants are extremely widely studied. They're not my focus. And so through some research, there's probably a more detailed answer to that question that y'all can find. That's my understanding of it, though. Good question. So native, yeah, it was in general, how can you encourage native ants to live in your yard? In general, ants benefit from a diversity of like secluded types of habitats, things like rotting wood, rock piles, places where those females will be able to start their new colonies, have a secure place, big rocks in contact with the ground, as I'm sure a lot of you have found just by lifting them, really, really great places for ants to start living. And then also providing that food in the form of nectar, plants that produce abundant seeds, allowing grass to grow and get to the seeding phase. That's going to provide a lot of food for ants that otherwise, if we get rid of grass as it's growing before it's allowed to seed, or if we plant plants that are not reproducing, then we're removing that food source that ants would be able to benefit from. All right, I can take some Zoom questions now too. Hey, you're welcome. Nah, I mean, if they were listening, I'm happy about it. Yeah, a thorough question.
So someone said, "Ooh, I need those soft lives. I need those."
Yeah, great question. So poison ivy sawflies, probably an animal that we wish someone was captive breeding to distribute around. As far as I know, there's not a place where you can buy them. If you find them, if you know what they look like and see one when you're in the park, you can certainly catch it and release it in your yard. But other than that, the main way to attract insects like that, if you have the food plant available, if you have other resources that they want, like female sawflies will be feeding on nectar as well. They might visit flowers in your yard and then also smell that poison ivy. It can sometimes just be a matter of waiting. If they're in the area, they'll come find your poison ivy. If they're not in the area yet, they will, they'll need to get there first. They don't seem to be as common in Texas as in the northern parts of the country. I've seen just a couple of them, but that's partly due to Texas not having that much poison ivy compared to places like Arkansas or Iowa. So hopefully you find some or they find you first.
So we have a question from Suzanne, who asked, "How are emerald ash borers in their native range?"
Yeah, so she asked, how are emerald ash borers kept in check in their native range? There are a ton of people who've worked on emerald ash borers because they're such an economically and environmentally significant pest. And they're an invasive species in the United States. I am not one of those people. I look at emerald ash borer and I'm like, you already have a dozen scientists who just do you. So I'm going to stay out of that. I cannot attest to any specific natural enemies that are in Asia where they are from. I can hypothesize parasitoid wasps probably play a really huge role. Parasitoid wasps hunt down wood-boring beetle larvae all over the world. Often each beetle that you encounter is going to have a wasp that targets it. And that would be my guess as to the primary control for emerald ash borers. This we do have parasitoid wasps, but we don't have the same ones. Parasitoid wasps are a biological control animal that's sometimes moved around in order to hunt down their prey species where it's introduced. And I think that I've read some articles about that with ash borers, but I don't want to talk about things I don't know very well. So I'm going to say that's going to have to be something that you look up. Yeah.
This one was about Ant Hill.
Oh, you can take that if you want. Yeah. This Facebook group called Ant-Man's Hill is one that I'm on all the time. It's an ID group and just a general bug discussion group where the moderators get so many animal, questions focused on insects and other arthropods, and will then post that question, that picture of an insect that someone took and sent to the group. And if they don't know it, they reach out to people like me who are going to. So if you have questions about the bugs that you're finding around, Ant-Man's Hill is a great place to join. You can search the group for species that you're curious about and find other photos and identification and info, or you can post your own pictures, submit them, and they should eventually get up there on the page where people like us can answer them.
Where they are present in the food source, in the first location, food source runs that.
Oh yeah. So they asked about moving insects from one location to another, especially something like a pipevine caterpillar. If their food source is no longer present, how harmful would it be to move those caterpillars? My answer is moving animals is always an ecologically sensitive sort of thing. Animal populations will vary widely through their range, and especially genetically, animals in one half of Texas, even if they're the same species, often gonna be pretty different from animals on the other side of the state. And so generally, I don't recommend moving animals over wide distances just because that can introduce something unexpected, whether that's a parasite or pathogen in that animal, or just the way that it's going to interact with its conspecifics. But if we're talking about neighborhood level, if we're talking about moving those caterpillars from an area where their host plant is locally exterminated to a place where there's plenty of it, and you're not driving across the state, that is not going to do any harm. That is within the range that those butterflies would be able to fly naturally. They'd probably end up there sooner or later, and you are probably saving those caterpillars' lives. Notably, a lot of caterpillars will disperse from their host plant when they're getting ready to pupate. And so if you just see a caterpillar walking along on the sidewalk away from its host plant, if it's a pretty large one especially, a lot of the time it has left its plant intentionally and it's going to try to find somewhere else to pupate. Usually they will pupate away from their host plant. That helps to reduce predator pressure. If they find one, that way they're not finding all of them. And so if you just see one and moving it from one place to another to try to help it out, I say thank you for caring about insects. But please don't grab a population of insects, move them far away where they might disrupt that habitat if they're not naturally present there. Yeah. Let's see if I can get to them. I'm pretty long-winded. Yeah.
So Mary asked, when wasps build near my door, I would often nest down, and it usually takes 1 or 2 times.
Oh.
They react more when I do it in the heat of the day.
Mm.
Simpler, where to why we are
That's a fantastic question. She asked about wasps being more irritable at. Yeah, probably paper wasps. Yellow jackets maybe too, but social wasps in general being more irritable in the heat of the day versus the early morning. This is due to two different things. Some of that is their sleep cycle. Insects do rest. Some studies indicate that invertebrates may even dream, which is very fascinating. But wasps sleep at night a lot of the time. They're gonna sleep in. And if you go out at 6 a.m. and knock that paper nest down, they have to wake up before they're going to come after you. And so that is the best time to relocate, especially a small developing wasp nest. If you knock that down, a lot of the time the queen, after especially 2 times of doing it, she's going to find somewhere else to build. The other part of it is due to insects being ectotherms. Their body temperature is influenced really, really strongly by the temperature of the area around them. And they just don't have much energy when they're cold. An insect who is cold cannot respond as quickly, cannot move as fast. A lot of the time is not going to show the same behaviors. And so when wasps are at 100-degree day, they are hyped up, they have all the energy, they're going to respond with full force and with the way that they want to. But if wasps are at 60 degrees, they're going to move more sluggishly. They are often going to avoid conflict. That's just by their nature of being not warm-blooded like we are. So if you do need to bring down paper wasp nests, if that's something that you are experienced in doing, feel comfortable with, do it in the morning and when the nests are small. We can get our last question if we have time. No problem, you've been a great assistant. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Good question. So alates are the winged reproductive termites that are going to fly around and leave their home colony. They are often, yeah, they're winged, they fly, they're all delicate. You can see them all over Texas. You can see winged termites flying often a decent distance away from an active termite nest. Because as they swarm and move around, they're carried by the wind, they're trying to disperse and get away from their home nest so they won't compete with it. It does not mean you have an infestation if you see a few winged termites. If you see a column of winged termites emerging from the side of your house, that is a different issue. Like I said, I do not give pest control advice very often. I'm not trained in that. But in Texas, our primary termites are subterranean termites who are living mostly underground and who are infiltrating usually damp wood that is not sealed or covered, that is in contact with the ground. And so if you know that you have termite vulnerable wood in your house, if you know that there is unfinished wood in contact with the ground that's structurally important, you should keep an eye out for termite alates. You should try to find the signs of termite infestation of that wood, just keep an eye on it. But if you see a few of them here and there floating on the wind, that is not just an automatic panic button. You should look for those signs around your place, but you know, most of the time it is not cause for worry. Can I tell about the ghost mantis? Yeah, just a little bit. Ghost mantis is one of the most popular pet praying mantises. This was the first exotic mantis species that I bred as pets. They are not native to Texas, and they probably would not survive super well in Texas. That said, never release a non-native insect species into the environment. But ghost mantises, really fascinating looking insects that are also pretty easy. If you want a pet bug and you don't mind feeding it other bugs, they are really, really cool animal to get to observe a praying mantis up close. They come in these really wild, twisted, dead leaf shapes, and they're native to Africa. They live from Madagascar all the way up through equatorial and northern Africa. So, yeah, great to talk about, but can't really go in deep about it here. It was great! Oh, yeah.
We have to switch mics here or we'll we'll have to Zoom people out. So thank you, Joshua. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I wish I had seen this before I went to the Nature Center this morning and was teaching students about bugs. So thank you very much. Okay, let's turn the Zoom people off. Bye, Zoom people. Glad y'all made it.